بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه أما بعد. So one of my students on the Essential Guide to Salah course sent through some really interesting question after lesson 1, which is an introduction to fiqh. So the questions are quite detailed and require some attention, so I decided that I'm gonna just make a video about this. It will be a good supplement to a long article that I have on the website, on the Mawarid Lifestyle website, as well as a video on the whole issue of, following the opinions of scholars and madhabs and things like that. I don't take like a really stringent opinion on a particular madhab or a particular opinion. I take the view that generally difference of opinion and different schools of thought are good for Islam, good for the Ummah, and they are indeed a mercy. Even though the actual hadith is weak, but the meaning is sound, pretty much is widely accepted by the ulama. And there are statements from the Salaf that support the idea that differences of opinion are good for the Ummah and are a mercy, and I'll talk about what that is. So when I talk about madhabs and following the opinions of scholars and etc., I don't really take that in a manner that reflects critically against people who don't follow a madhab necessarily. For me, these aren't issues that we should be fighting over, even though people do. But I think if you take that kind of an approach and then approach all of these issues as matters of that reflect our intellectual legacy, our intellectual diversity, the intellectual dynamism that exists within Islam, the flexibility that exists within Islam. If you kind of get away from this, it has to be like this or like that view, get away from the squabbles in masajid and move on to the whole question of how this contributes to our intellectual tradition, then it's a lot easier to appreciate these things. So the questions are, this is probably going to be something of a long video, but I'll try and, in the information, I'll try and mark out which question is answered at which minute, maybe, so people can jump to what they're interested in. So the first question is, what are the potential wisdoms and benefits of difference of opinion? Some may argue that it's better to unify the madhabs and have only one opinion because it will prevent confusion and arguments between people, and practically it will make life easier. Is this fair to say? As a response, I have heard others say that difference of opinion is a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it allows human beings to use their intellect, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to do in the Qur'an. What are your thoughts on this, Shaykh? So that's the first question. So firstly, this idea that it's better to unify the madhabs. If you understand how our tradition works and how we understand scripture, how we understand Qur'an and Hadith, and how we interpret Qur'an and Hadith, and how it's been done from the time of the Sahaba, then you will simply understand that that unifying the madhabs, if you understand madhabs as they are, that is schools of interpretation, schools of juristic interpretation. You've got to remember what these things are. Madhabs are not, they're not cults, they're not sects, they're not political factions to unify. These are schools of interpretation. These are intellectual schools. It just so happens that because they're about jurisprudence and they reflect on the way we live our lives within certain aspects of our religious practice, for that reason, those intellectual discussions come and permeate and affect our lives. But that is true of any intellectual tradition, right? Whether that is whether that is what goes on in medical research eventually affects the kind of medication and treatment that we receive. What goes on in engineering research eventually reflects on the buildings that we live in and the way our roads are designed, etc. So this isn't something that is unprecedented. This is quite normal. What goes on in the intellectual arena affects people in their lives, and either you have to create a separation between what goes on in the intellectual space and what people consume, or people have to become more informed. There's no third way. So if you understand that, then you realize that the idea of unification isn't possible because the issue exists in the intellectual space. It does not exist in the political space. Unification is possible in political issues, right? So I'll give you two things you have to bear in mind. So when in the difference of opinion and aqeedah that have happened historically, the Mu'tazilites once managed to gain favor in the political establishment, right? And the Khalifa favored their opinion, and Sunni scholars were persecuted as a result. But that persecution that persecution was fundamentally problematic because of the fact that the debate was intellectual in nature. So nothing came of it, right? The ulama, they stuck to what they felt was the truth. And eventually when that Khalifa, that particular ruler, died, and another ruler took his position, the tide basically changed. So the same thing is true. And the irony, I was reading somewhere that the irony about the Mu'tazila using political power to enforce their opinion on others, which is basically what has to happen in any attempt to unify madhabs. You have to do it by force, because it's intellectual in nature. It's born out of what people believe to be true, right? So therefore, they won't want to give it up by force. They'll only give up their opinion if they are convinced that their opinion is incorrect. That is the only way to do it. So when the Mu'tazilites used that, the irony that was pointed out is that the Mu'tazilites are supposed to be a hyper-rational movement, a hyper-rational sect. But despite their commitment to rationality, they resorted to a situation where they tried to politically force their opinions onto others. And that's basically the irony. It's exactly the same irony in talking about unifying madhabs. It's just not possible because of the nature of the beast, if you like, right? These are matters of the intellect. You have to convince people. If it so happens that everybody in the world is convinced by one madhab and not another, then fine. But even that, people have tried and they failed, right? People came up with the narrative that madhab should be unified, but then ended up disagreeing among themselves, right? And became multiple kind of strands within their own madhab, if you want to call them that, or within their own school of thought. Why? Because the nature of just intellectual activity, the nature of interpretive activity, is that it results in different points of view and different perspectives, which results in difference of opinion. And that is a human thing. Because it's a human thing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam allowed it to remain because it is part of our nature. Otherwise, the Sharia or our tradition would be working against our nature. Does that make sense? So that it's important to basically recognize what this is. What essentially to talk about unifying madhabs is to talk about political expediency, political convenience. This is not a matter of political convenience. This is a matter of exerting our intellect, i.e., it's a matter of ijtihaad, right? And there is no such thing as force in ijtihaad, in that whole domain, in that whole arena, in that whole space. Which kind of brings me to the alternative view that you mentioned, which is that others have said that difference of opinion is a mercy from Allah and it allows human beings to use their intellect. Well, yes, I would agree with that, right? Because that's the only thing that makes sense. The view that people have to unite. The only way it can happen is coincidentally, meaning if incidentally, right? One scholar was so brilliant, one scholar in the Ummah was so brilliant, so convincing, and his or her opinions were so far-reaching, and they had such a long life that they were able to debate and convince everybody of their view, then by coincidence you may end up with a situation that everybody agrees on the same madhab. But then the next year or generation after that person, it can change again, because another scholar can come and be equally convincing. So there you go, right? Meaning it's just not the way it works. So that's the first thing. Another interesting thing that you should bear in mind is that sometimes what happens is that the Khalifa can prefer a madhab, right? Meaning that the Islamic State can run the affairs of the state according to one particular set of views or one particular madhab. The way throughout early Islamic history, the state was run for most of Islamic history. State affairs in the Khilafah were run according to the Hanafi madhab, as a result of which a lot of law legislation in Muslim countries, even today, in places like Palestine and so on, is kind of based upon the Hanafi madhab, right? That's kind of like the legacy of that history. But that political preference, meaning the preference of the Khalifa, or the preference of the ruler of a particular set of opinions, and therefore appointing judges and state legislators who kind of were of that view, did not result in them imposing that view on scholarship. All they did was they simply ruled according to that school of thought. They didn't impose that school of thought on people's salah, on people's fasting, or on the debates of the ulama, or on the way that ulama taught fiqh and so on and so forth. They didn't do that, right? So that's an important thing to remember about our history as well. Okay, whenever people have tried to force an opinion upon others, right, it has resulted in disaster, and they have always been remembered as a futile exercise, and actually an act of stupidity, because it defies the nature of knowledge, and the nature of our epistemology, the nature of our jurisprudence, the nature of how we interpret text and so on, right? Which is the way Allah and His Messenger wanted it. That much is clear, and you can refer to my video on this issue. It's quite a long one, but basically I talk about all of that in that video. I'll put it in the video information. Okay, question number 2. It was mentioned that where things are unclear and not categoric, this is what causes differences of opinion amongst the scholars. Some argue due to this that if Islam is clear and the Prophet came to make things easy for people, then why is there uncertainty over the meaning of certain ayahs or hadeeths which Allah has revealed, causing all of this differing? Rather, the evidences should be easy to understand, preventing difference of opinion. How does one respond to this? So the underlying assumption behind this question is that somehow difference of opinion is bad. This is the underlying assumption behind this type of thinking. The assumption is difference of opinion is bad, right? No, difference of opinion is a way of life. It's a part of life. It's a part of human life. The way all human beings are in all of their facets of life, we have difference of opinion. The only way for human beings to basically move on and to get along and to have unity is to accept that they have to find models of unity that accommodates their difference of opinion. Otherwise, unity isn't possible, right? If you look at human history, the only time that there have been long periods of unity is when the principles of that unification, of that unity, have been sophisticated enough to accommodate difference of opinion. That's because that's just how we are as human beings, right? And Islam is the religion of fitrah. It's deenul fitrah, right? And therefore it makes sense for the deen of fitrah to be in conformity with human nature, and that means that within our deen, there is the sophistication that it allows for the accommodation of difference of opinion. What the deen does not like is is discord, political discord that results in people hating each other, criticizing each other, doing ghiba of each other, backbiting one another, spying on one another, trying to politically maneuver against one another, fighting one another, killing one another. These are the things that the Sharia has disliked. The Sharia does not dislike difference of opinion when it comes to interpreting matters of deen, provided that the way in which the difference of opinion is conducted does not result in strife. Right? That's important. So when we disagree on a matter, the fact of the disagreement isn't the problem. The manner of the disagreement is the problem. You disagree and you start calling each other deviant, you start calling each other mubtadi, you start calling each other liar, you start calling each other, you start throwing names, start calling each other ignorant, etc., etc. Then that now moves from valid difference of opinion to basically poor character, right? Isa'atul adab, poor etiquette towards your brother. It turns into abuse. It turns into all of those things, which are all signs of discord, tanazur, right? Which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade in the Qur'an. Okay? So it's important to deal with this underlying assumption to the question that difference of opinion is bad. If you can overcome that assumption, then you realize that actually the Sharia didn't do anything bad. Allah and His Messenger leaving room for difference of opinion, they did not somehow jeopardize our ability to achieve unity. Only we jeopardized our ability to have unity, because the Sahaba, when they had serious difference of opinion that led to political strife and led to infighting and so on. If you think about it, it was based on political issues. All right, it wasn't juristic difference of opinion that led to political problems. The Ummah is not disunited because of the fiqh of Salah, right? You know, we're disunited over Palestine. That's got nothing to do with the fiqh of Salah. It's got nothing to do with jurisprudence at all, right? People moan about, oh, why can't we unite? Well, we don't have to if you understand your fiqh. We don't have to if you understand your fiqh, right? This is the thing. I often say that, you know, that there is this profound irony in the fact that often people argue in the masajid while the ulama that they follow and base their opinions on don't argue among themselves. Sometimes they do, but there is a context to it. And if they do genuinely argue and squabble, then perhaps they need to revisit their learning, right? I'm talking about the ulama here. It does happen, sadly. So anyway, so should everything have been left clear? No, that's not necessary. And how and what would you rather have? Would you have 100 volumes of information answering in detail every single issue that is going to arrive until Qiyamah? There is a context to this. The Prophet ﷺ is the final messenger whose message had to serve until the end of time. That means that his ummah had to shoulder a certain responsibility of adapting the deen to different times and different places, because it was a global, it was a deen. The Prophet ﷺ brought a deen that was to span over every single land and custom and culture, and it had to also survive all the way until Qiyamah. And that either required a revelation that was so detailed and it went into so much minutiae that it was hundreds of volumes, or it had to be a revelation that was based on principle and that gave autonomy to the ummah to then interpret based on those principles. And that's basically what was done, and it was wise and it was right. Right? We argue because we don't know how to disagree. We squabble, we fight because we don't know how to disagree. And for that you have to study adabul ikhtilaf, and people have to visit their akhlaq. That's what it boils down to. Okay, last question. You mentioned that ijtihaad can only be done by high caliber scholars who have vast amounts of knowledge of the Islamic sciences. If this is the case, then why is it that scholars who are not mujtahids do ijtihaad on contemporary issues and give their opinions when they are asked, or mention the strongest opinion from their perspective, rather than refer the people to the mujtahids of our time, such as Mufti Taqi Uthmani? For example, I have heard some scholars, even students of knowledge, discussing and giving their opinions on contemporary issues such as forex trading, cryptocurrency, mortgages on houses, etc. But surely this is far beyond their scope. So again, there's assumptions here. So it is not necessarily, I don't know who these students of knowledge are and what their caliber is. And it is also not true that to express an opinion in a matter you have to be a scholar of the caliber of Mufti Taqi Uthmani, or you have to be a mujtahid, etc. Nor is it true that when somebody says, when a scholar says, in my opinion, that phrase, in my opinion, does not necessarily reflect ijtihad. So there are a number of misunderstandings here. So first of all, when we often use, and particularly nowadays, we often use the word ijtihad loosely, right? We don't actually, when we say ijtihad, there's the ijtihad of the four imams, right, which is ijtihad mutlaq. There's the ijtihad of their students and their students' students. There's a level of ijtihad done by the average mufti. There's a level of ijtihad done by somebody who's perusing different opinions and trying to determine which one they feel is most preferable according to their understanding. And so the word term ijtihad is used loosely to mean lots of different levels of interpretation. And what level of interpretation somebody is engaging in depends really on the details of the mas'ala, right? So the kind of ijtihad you might be talking about, the assumption here is that we're talking about ijtihad where no prior opinion exists, right? It's a completely new issue. Nothing in the Qur'an, nothing in the Sunnah, nothing in the fiqh of the previous masters of Islamic jurisprudence and the ulama has anything that even remotely relates to this master, and therefore completely new ijtihad is required. Well, that level of newness, if you like, right, is rare, right? And when it does happen, eventually ulama do develop opinions, but these kind of things happen over time. And what then happens is students of knowledge, etc., they participate in that conversation, right? Even teachers who perhaps are part of the conversation, they discuss the issue with their students. The students find it interesting, and it develops their ability, their own interpretive skills, it develops their own ijtihad, right? Their own fiqh. Now, when somebody says, in my opinion, they may not necessarily be doing ijtihad, but may simply be saying that there's two different views on this matter, both of which are valid. Different scholars have taken, some scholars have taken opinion A, some scholars have taken opinion B. I prefer opinion B. And they may well be qualified enough to be able to make that preference. They're not making ijtihad, they're just making preference between, they're weighing two different views and making a preference between the two of them. And that may well be valid. The question really is, what about you as the layperson? What should you do? Well, you should follow the scholars who you rely on, right? And if you cannot decide between two differing opinions, between two sets of scholars, because you rely on both of them equally, then you go with your spiritual conscience, meaning that sometimes your spiritual conscience will require you to be cautious and careful if you can, right? As far as possible, we should go with our conscience, right? Istafti qalbak, as the hadith says. The Prophet ﷺ told us, ask your heart. And this is to do with trying to take the cautious road if you can. If you can't, because the requirements of taking the cautious road compete with a dire necessity, then it is permissible for you to go with your necessity. Does that make sense? Provided that a scholar that you rely on advises you that it's okay for you to do that. Or it's possible to even say that it is that as a principle, it is permissible for a person to go with dire necessity if an opinion is in accord with that necessity. But if they can avoid that and take the route of precaution, then that would be the conscientious and morally superior thing to do, right? Because it's in line with avoiding ambiguous matters, which the Prophet ﷺ encouraged. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever avoids the shubuhat, he has protected his religion, right, and his honor, right? And similarly, the Prophet ﷺ said, istafti qalbak, which implies that, go with what your conscience basically supports. So this is what we have to do. So sometimes when we throw around the word ijtihad, basically we're making a lot of assumptions, and trying to reduce and simplify a concept that actually has a lot of nuances, right? And when people use the term ijtihad, there's probably a level that they are talking about that has gone beyond the audience. The audience is thinking it's just one thing when there are lots and lots of different levels of ijtihad, and the ijtihad of no two people is the same, right? Especially if they are not of the same level of knowledge and seniority. However, as if I was advising students of knowledge, right, who are novices, new to the scene, just graduated, young, in their 20s, even in their 30s, then I would caution them against using words like "in my opinion," especially if you don't have the required expertise and so on. It is not a good thing to do. It is something that is criticized by ulama. It's looked down upon heavily. Ulama have been very, very careful about using words like "in my opinion" and so on. And if you do use the term "in my opinion," then try to clarify what you mean by that. All right. So, some of us, we're in our 40s and 50s, and we might use the term, but we feel uncomfortable, or we use it in a classroom setting or in a teaching context. These things shouldn't be just bandied about. All right. And if they are used, then remember, often it's being probably used contextually. Good scholars would, if they do use it, they would use it, but they'd have a clear context in terms of what they mean. And what they don't mean, in 99% of cases, what they don't mean is the absolute ijtihad of the mujtahids. When they say "in their opinion," all they mean is there's two possibilities here, and in their opinion they are preferring one of those two possibilities, and it is within their prerogative and their malaka, their juristic ability to do that. Okay, inshallah ta'ala. So yeah, and if you don't know absolutely what we're talking about and you want to study this more, this kind of thing more, then perhaps study after courses. These questions came out from a student on the essential guide to Salah course, inshallah ta'ala, and anybody watching this video is welcome to join it. Jazakumullah khairan. I hope that answers the questions. Of course, we will continue the questions and answers in our chat group, and when I get really interesting questions, I'll make a video. I just thought, let me just quickly make a video of it, so I did today. It doesn't mean I'll do it every time, but I will try and do that inshallah, so that the knowledge can be shared more. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.